Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. I'm your host, Kiana Canada. Welcome back to the Kiana Canada Show. Before we get into tonight's topic, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Remember that your likes and your shares, what it does is it pushes videos like this up in the algorithm. It tells the algorithm that videos like this are important. Ladies and gentlemen, it's Black History Month, of course, in the United States. I'm a Black American, and so this month I'm really going to be focusing on Black American issues to commemorate this particular month. As you know, two Black journalists were arrested in Minneapolis for holding press and conducting interviews in City's Church in Minneapolis. And that was Don Lemon and Georgia Fort. Nekima Armstrong was also arrested. She's a civil rights lawyer and an activist in Minneapolis. Now, I believe Georgia Fort is biracial. She's half Black and I think half white. But at any rate, there were two journalists, Don Lemon and Georgia Fort, who, as we know, was arrested after Nekima Armstrong. And essentially what we first discovered is that courts had declined to indict Don Lemon and Georgia Fort and others for their First Amendment activities, such as freedom of the press. And then the DOJ found some way to bring charges against these two. Now, some have speculated as to whether Nicki Minaj inveigled Trump to bring these charges against Don Lemon. Some feel that this was inevitable because of the action of holding press in a church, which I don't think that argument will hold up under scrutiny. And then some believe that this is what was to be expected just by virtue of protesting against the Trump administration. The arrest of Don Lemon and Georgia Fort, as well as Nekima Armstrong, captures the zeitgeist of the late 1960s. And you may say, well, Kiana, how is that so? Well, if you remember, there were three activists, citizen journalists: James Chaney, a Black American civil rights activist, and there were two Jewish students and citizen journalists named Michael Schwerner and Andrew Goodman. In 1964, they were investigating the burning of a church. In other words, they were exercising what appeared to be their right to participate as citizen journalists, collecting, reporting, analyzing, and disseminating news and information related to this particular incident. They were seeking to speak with churchgoers about that intimidation and that incident. And while they were engaged in this protected activity, which was citizen journalism, essentially that is what it is. It wasn't called that during this particular time in the 1960s, but we come to understand that is essentially what they were doing. Much like Don Lemon and Georgia Fort, they experienced intimidation by authority figures, or this lynch mob connected to authority. And the person that was leading this lynch mob was Cecil Price. Now, I believe that the facts are a little bit vague, but Chaney, Schwerner, and Goodman all were arrested. And then I think that they were released. And when they were released, they were being followed by this lynch mob. And after this had happened, they were murdered, regrettably. And so this led to the arrest of Cecil Price. This arrest took place in 1967, so it took approximately 3 years or 3.5 years to bring him to justice. And guess what? Cecil Price and others were charged with conspiracy to deprive Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman of their civil rights. And guess under what act? The Enforcement Act of 1870. This was the first Ku Klux Klan Act, ladies and gentlemen. Isn't that interesting? And so we know that this act has evolved throughout the years and is connected to the FACE Act and has changed its name. But aren't there some parallels happening here? There's some interesting parallels, I think. I am also of the opinion, ladies and gentlemen, that this case is going to make its way to the U.S. Supreme Court. If not a federal court, I believe that this case is going to be like a landmark case in the United States, because there are two conflicting rights, and this is religious freedoms and press freedoms. But I am of the opinion, let me be clear, that the press freedoms, the argument for press freedoms in this particular case are stronger. And I'll tell you why. There are 3 levels. There's 3 levels of tests. There are 3 tests. So there's a tier, and at 3 levels, which the court considers when they're considering whether a statute or a piece of legislation violates the rights of American citizens. The first is rational basis. And with rational basis, this is the lowest test, and its rights are not necessarily deemed fundamental. And this is the most lenient test. And then we have intermediate scrutiny. And this plays an important role in ensuring that legislatures do not use ostensibly legitimate purposes to disguise efforts to suppress fundamental rights. Now, a statute survives intermediate scrutiny if it advances an important governmental interest unrelated to suppression of freedom of speech, suppression of free speech, and does not burden substantially more speech than necessary to further those interests. And the third and the most stringent is strict scrutiny, which is reserved for laws that restrict the most fundamental rights. I am of the opinion that if this case makes its way to the U.S. Supreme Court, that we are going to see this case come under intermediate scrutiny, because there is an intolerable conflict between those that would argue religious freedoms and those that would argue the freedom of the press. In my personal opinion, I believe that the argument for the right to freedom of speech, the right to freedom of the press, is stronger in this particular situation, because, ladies and gentlemen, the press has a right to hold public officials, including those within churches, accountable for their actions. And I just think there are consequences to restricting the right to conduct press in a church. For example, there has been times where the government has entered into a church to apprehend an asylum seeker. And I have seen videos where asylum seekers were in a circle praying with pastors and churchgoers. And the government, the law enforcement, come in and apprehend those asylum seekers. And it raises an important question as to whether that violates the FACE Act, right? Because apprehending an asylum seeker within a church is a form of intimidation. Some could argue it intimidates the people in the church. It stops the persons from praying. There has also been instances, as we know, where the government has entered into a church to apprehend alleged criminals or suspects. And this has been in situations where the alleged persons have claimed that the government's actions are wrongful and that charges are being brought against them wrongfully. And so it raises an important question, right, as to who is allowed to enter this church or to enter churches and to hold someone responsible for a particular act, right? Ladies and gentlemen, there was a time, if you recall, this was like a year or two ago, where there was a woman who was a churchgoer, and she was within a church, and I think she was part of the congregation, but she stood up on the stage and she confronted her pastor or the deacon or the person who is leading the church service. She confronted him because that person violated her rights when she was a child. I believe that she was molested when she was a child by this church pastor or this priest, and she confronted him in front of the congregation. Now, was that a form of intimidation? Because we know that that actually stopped church service and stopped the congregation from listening to the priest and paying attention to the public statement of the victim in that particular situation. And so, ladies and gentlemen, like I said, this is going to be a very interesting case because there is a public interest element in conducting press within church, holding priests, deacons, pastors accountable for alleged wrongdoing. Essentially, that is what Nekima Armstrong, Don Lemon, or Nekima Armstrong is alleging that she was doing, is that she was holding a pastor to account who wasn't available that day, but she was holding him to account for those actions because there were information that was resurrected that he was an ICE officer and then a pastor. So there is like this conflict, right? And there's also like this moral conflict, this ethical conflict. And then you have the arguments from Don Lemon and Georgia Fort, who have stated clearly that they were asking critical questions, that they were not part of the protest, that they were essentially, ladies and gentlemen, trying to understand why the protesters were there, and not only trying to understand why the protesters were there, but was trying to get the story and hear both sides. So hear the sides of the protesters and hear the sides of the churchgoers or the priest that was in the church. So I am of the opinion, ladies and gentlemen, that this is definitely going to be a case that is going to make its way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, because there is a strong argument that press freedoms, as we know, freedom of the press is contained within the First Amendment, that is coming under attack in the United States. And there might be a lawyer in the United States that could argue that this really does come under strict scrutiny. So it remains to be seen. Again, I personally believe that the test that will be applied is intermediate scrutiny, but we'll see how this pans out. And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. We'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.